plan to post the recording and the slides on our website after this webinar. So good morning, and thank you so much. Welcome for joining us. Welcome to this webinar on Mass DEC's open solicitation relating to expanding access to opportunity in the offshore wind workforce. My name is Kirsten Holland, and I am the Offshore Wind Program Manager here at Mass DEC, and I'm joined today by my colleagues Bruce Carlisle and Julie Raffetto. If you could please go to the next slide, Bruce. Oh, a little bit of a delay, maybe. Next slide, Bruce.
Yes, sorry, Kirsten. It's not happy with my, let me stop sharing and then reshare. It's not letting me advance.
Sure.
Apologies, everyone. Kirsten, you seeing that?
Yes.
Yeah, still not happy with advancing. Okay, there we
that
go.
Worked. Perfect.
Excellent.
Great, thanks. So during today's webinar, we'll start by going over some housekeeping items very quickly. Bruce will provide some background and context on offshore wind in Massachusetts and Mass DEC's role in offshore wind workforce development, or in offshore wind sector development sort of more broadly. I will then provide an overview more specifically of offshore wind workforce development efforts to date. And then we'll go through the various elements of the solicitation. And at the end, we'll make sure we leave some time for Q&A. Next slide, Bruce. I do want to note that this webinar, as I said, is being recorded. We will plan to post the recording along with the slides from today's presentation on the active solicitations page, where you probably signed up for this webinar to begin with. As I mentioned, we will be taking questions at the end of the presentation. And in order to ask a question, we ask that you please type it into the chat function at the bottom of your screen. So there may also be a Q&A function, but we will only be using the chat function today. So please type any questions you have into that chat function at the bottom of your screen. Or if you'd prefer, you can also click the raise hand button that you'll have at the bottom of your screen. And that will allow you to let us know that you'd like to ask your question verbally. So if you do choose to raise your hand, the webinar moderators will let you know when it is your turn to speak and give you permission to unmute yourself and ask your question verbally. I do also want to note that Mass DEC has a formal written Q&A process, question and answer process for solicitations and RFPs like this. So while we definitely look forward to having a great conversation and discussion today, we do require that all questions be submitted to Mass DEC in writing to receive a formal response. And applicants should rely only on that formal written response from Mass DEC as official solicitation guidance. All written questions must be submitted to offshorewind@massdec.com by April 7th, and Mass DEC plans to post submitted questions and the responses on the solicitation page by April 16th. And you can find more information about all of this question and answer period in the full solicitation as well. And we'll discuss it at the end as well. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to my colleague Bruce to provide some background and context on Mass DEC offshore wind in Massachusetts.
Excellent. Thank you, Kirsten, so much. Kirsten, can you just check that video and audio are working?
Yes, looks good.
Great. Thank you, everyone, for taking time today and joining us on this webinar. We've got a couple goals, as Kirsten stated earlier in the agenda, one of which is to provide some additional context and information for those of you who may not pay as close attention to the offshore wind industry and market, as we do here at Mass DEC, being our focus. So my role today is to take you through a little bit of some background and some context, speaking really specifically about offshore wind in Massachusetts, but also placing that within the context of the U.S. market. First, quickly on the Massachusetts Clean Energy Center, you can see here on this slide, our mission, and I'll sort of paraphrase here, really is to advance renewable energy in the Commonwealth to help meet our climate goals while growing our clean energy economy. And you can see a couple of the accomplishments of many, and I would point people to our 10-year impact report, if you're interested in understanding a little bit more about our journey. We were created by the legislature in 2009. We are a quasi-state public agency, which means we are governed by an independent board of directors, chaired by the Secretary of Energy and Environmental Affairs, and with other government officials, but also with private sector academics and nonprofits serving on our board. And you can see here below, we've been through a bit of a transition in terms of Mass CEC sort of strategic focus over the last, I think probably 12 to 18 months. And you can see down below the four areas which will be sort of representing our core focus over the next several years and beyond. High performance buildings, clean transportation, net zero grid, and of course what we're talking about today is offshore wind. At Mass CEC, offshore wind has been one of our core program areas since our inception. And generally speaking, we support the Commonwealth in the responsible development of offshore wind. And more specifically, you can see here at the top, we really are working to reduce project risk, increase market confidence, and very specific today, support the economic and job opportunities that this industry presents. You can see here on this slide that these are the three areas in which we work, and I will come back to this towards the end of my remarks. So I think it's really, really important to say and put this in context. We are at a tipping point, I think, in the US. Our colleagues in Europe for more than a decade have recognized all of the benefits of offshore wind in particular, and have really been leaders, global leaders, in developing and helping to innovate not only the technology, but everything else that goes with it. And so for Massachusetts and for the US, we have this significant renewable resource literally just off our shores. And a lot of work has gone in over the past decade or more in preparing us for the development of offshore wind responsibly. There's a lot of benefits to offshore wind, which I think support its role as being a really, really important part of our energy portfolio for the next several decades as we look to meet the Commonwealth's aggressive climate goals. But I think importantly, we are really at a unique situation where we are in the US really set to grow a substantial new industry here from the ground up. And it presents a significant amount of both economic as well as workforce opportunities. You can see some of the figures down below. Those are courtesy of our colleagues at American Wind Energy Association, which is now America Clean Power Association. Most of the wind, if not all of the wind development that folks will see over the next years will occur well offshore in federal waters. And therefore, this slide just reminds folks that the federal government is really the lead entity on the siting and planning and leasing and environmental reviews. That's not to say that the state, local governments, counties, and others don't have important roles, but this is largely a federal process, essentially siting renewable energy on the outer continental shelf, which is one of the federal government's important roles here. And in that role, that is led by the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management. And I think the graphic here is really intended to, I don't want you to sort of focus on, each of these different colors and these stages along the way, but it's intended to convey that the federal process is multi-phased, sort of stepwise, from planning and siting through leasing to project-specific reviews and project development. And really, this is not only multi-phase, but multi-year. Mass CEC and our colleagues at the Energy and Environmental Affairs Office and their agencies, including Coastal Zone Management and Marine Fisheries, and our colleagues at the Department of Energy Resources, all play a coordinating role with the federal government on the offshore wind process. And then one little note here, and this is really, I think, kind of important, because the journey as really sort of the first state sort of leading the way and spearheading this, and the first project, Vineyard Wind, and I'll speak a little bit more about this in a minute, has really been through some, I don't want to say stops and starts, but some pauses and some additional requirements that have been placed on it. And you know, what you're looking at here is essentially more than a 5-year process in its environmental reviews, which is something that I think folks are going to be working on to try to shorten that process. In terms of Massachusetts, I mentioned before our sort of our leadership in this space, and I think a lot of that is manifested in a landmark bill law that passed in 2016. Legislature passed and Governor Baker signed, requiring the Department of Energy Resources and the utilities to solicit 1,600 megawatts of, and this is important, cost-effective offshore wind. So the first request for proposals went out, and after that very extensive review, the Vineyard Wind project was selected really as the first commercial scale offshore wind project, not only for Massachusetts, but in the US, at a price that surprised a lot of people, and I think really woke up many states to the essentially, the appeal and utility of offshore wind. In 2018, the statute was amended and increased our goal to 3,200 megawatts. And then our second procurement was run, and Mayflower Wind was selected, also at a very, very cost competitive price. This slide's intended to give sort of an overview of the Southern New England region with the 7 lease areas. Right now, the largest renewable energy, wind energy area on the Outer Continental Shelf, which at different points in the leasing process, site control has been obtained by 4 very highly qualified developers. We talked about Vineyard Wind and Mayflower Wind, but also Ørsted, which did absorb Deepwater Wind. You may have heard of Deepwater Wind, as well as Equinor Wind, which for this lease area is a joint partnership with BP. And I think the other thing to point out on this slide is that while Massachusetts has procured projects for our energy portfolio, so have our colleagues in Rhode Island, in Connecticut, and New York. At this point in time, totaling over 5 gigawatts of essentially contracted offshore wind. And not only our colleagues in New England, but really down the Atlantic seaboard and now out on the Pacific, and actually in the Great Lakes as well, we're seeing a significant turn, if you will, to offshore wind. With, at this point in time, state commitments or state targets or goals, either through legislation or executive order or other firm type of commitments, are totaling over 29 gigawatts. And through state-led procurements, more than or nearly 12 gigawatts have been selected to date. In Massachusetts, we have our third procurement underway. The RFP, after going through a public comment and review process, is now with the Department of Public Utilities. The RFP is expected to be issued in May, with bids due from developers in September and a selection made in December. And then I've got this other note here, and I think this is really important as we sort of look out beyond the currently authorized 3,200 megawatts to what the future may hold. There's a climate energy bill sitting on Governor Maker's desk, which has additional authorization of 2.4 gigawatts. And the 2050 roadmap to net zero ran through really detailed assessments and scenarios of how we get to net zero by 2050. And really in nearly all of the scenarios, in terms of sort of low cost, reliable, renewable energy, offshore wind comprises the bulk of generation, with about estimated at 15 to 20 gigawatts over the next 30 years. I mentioned at the top the sort of three areas in which the Mass CEC team works. Here's just a few sort of examples. I don't want to spend a lot of time. We want to get to the solicitation, but this is more to say that we do work very closely with our state colleagues, but also with industry. And that's not just the developers, but it's the manufacturers and the other businesses and companies who are actively in the offshore wind industry, and those who are looking to participate. In particular, and our topic today is ensuring both through studies and assessments, and then through investments and providing technical assistance and other coordination and collaboration roles, really ensuring that we are starting to provide the tools that we're going to be able to grow and mature a workforce that's going to be capable, that's going to be effective, with a focus on health and safety. So with that, I do want to just touch on two quick other facilities that are related to offshore wind. This one, which was designed and is owned and operated by Mass CEC, the New Bedford Marine Commerce Terminal. It is the first specific purpose-built port in the U.S. for offshore wind. It's 29 acres. With special engineering such that across the entirety of this site, we have this high load design that can handle the very heavy and massive turbine components, as well as a reinforced quayside or bulkhead, as you may call it, to be able to load, unload the vessels that will be both bringing those in and then deploying them out to the wind farm sites. And the Wind Technology Test Center, which is the largest test blade facility in North America. Again, designed, owned, and operated by Mass CEC, offers the full suite of industry certifications, as well as the stands and environment for research and development in blade technology. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to my colleague, Kirsten, who is our lead on workforce and sector development. And Kirsten, back to you.
Great. Thanks, Bruce. Perfect. So yeah, like Bruce said, I'm going to do a run through of, workforce development, specifically relating to offshore wind, as Bruce has said, has been a huge focus of our work in the offshore wind space to date, largely because offshore wind just is a pretty much a brand new industry here in Massachusetts and here in the US more broadly. And so while we have a really highly skilled, capable workforce here in Massachusetts, there's a certain degree of sort of upskilling, retraining, additional information and education that will be needed in order for our Massachusetts workforce to be able to serve and get employed on projects offshore. So our offshore wind workforce work really started with an assessment that we released in 2018. We partnered with Bristol Community College, the UMass Dartmouth Public Policy Center, and the Massachusetts Maritime Academy to essentially assess the workforce needs and economic impact associated with 1,600 megawatts of offshore wind development. And you'll note that assessment was it looked at 1,600 megawatts. Obviously, Massachusetts' goal is now 3,200 megawatts, as you heard from Bruce, that will likely increase moving forward. So this is we see this as kind of a baseline, but it is still very helpful to understand some of the, the thousands of sort of direct jobs in construction, installation, and operations and maintenance associated with the offshore wind industry that will be coming to Massachusetts with just 1,600 megawatts of build out. And this assessment further demonstrated that the economic impact associated with offshore wind development here in Massachusetts will also be very significant, in the hundreds of millions in terms of direct economic impact. Next slide, please, Bruce. So I did just quickly want to touch on a couple of resources that we've put together. You may have seen some of them. They are linked to in the solicitation itself, as well as in the online page, the web page that we have where the solicitation is hosted. But we have put together some resources that may be helpful if you're sort of new to the offshore wind space, or even if you aren't. For instance, these career pathway maps that we've put together are actually a new resource that we think will be really helpful in providing essentially information for the industry and for workforce development experts and specialists to understand what the occupational needs are associated with offshore wind, how somebody might be able to enter and progress through this industry, and really understanding some of the very specific occupational data relating to different jobs in the offshore wind industry. So I definitely recommend, if you haven't already, to check out our offshore wind career pathway maps on cleanenergyeducation.org. Again, we'll provide links to all of that both on our website and in the chat as well. We also have put together a 2-page overview of sort of offshore wind workforce development in Massachusetts broadly, so definitely take a look at that as well. Cleanenergyeducation.org also has an education and training inventory that lists all of the training and educational programs we have here in Massachusetts, specifically relating to offshore wind. It also is broader. We have clean energy training and education programs throughout the Commonwealth. So this is something that you should definitely check out as well if you're interested in learning more about clean energy training and education. We've also been working to put together a community of practice. We've been piloting this for offshore wind. And basically the idea here is to start networking different entities and organizations and institutions that are setting up workforce training and development for offshore wind, so that they're aware of what other programs exist and they can start working together to identify challenges and barriers that sort of are common across different programs and start to work together to identify solutions. So we have a little bit more information on our website about that. And can certainly provide additional information as that continues to progress. And then, as I mentioned, this is just a link to the 2018 workforce assessment that I was speaking to on the last slide. Next slide, please. And so this is really some of the meat, probably the biggest meat of our workforce development initiatives to date. This really grew, so to date, basically, we've made a series of grants to organizations, institutions, training providers throughout Massachusetts to start putting together and standing up some of these really high need workforce training programs in the Commonwealth for offshore wind. Like I said, this is a new industry. There are certain trainings that just didn't exist here or haven't existed or still don't exist that will be required for this industry. And so making sure that we have those offered here is going to be really essential to getting Massachusetts workers to be able to participate in the offshore wind industry. And so the objective of these grants really grew out of, like I said, that 2018 assessment, where we were looking at the opportunity that we have here in Massachusetts to get workers into there's just going to be a huge need for people to work throughout so many different scopes of the offshore wind development, phases of offshore wind development. And so making these grants, we are really working to advance the training, education, and workforce development ecosystem here in Massachusetts to be capable and qualified to serve the offshore wind industry. So to date, we've made 2 rounds of grants for workforce training and development. The first, you can see the awards to the 6 institutions at the top of the screen there. Those really focused on some of those very early investments and high need, absolutely critical programs like health and safety training that will be required of all workers who will be stepping foot on an offshore wind turbine. We also put together, these have included partnerships with skilled trades, a graduate level certificate program to introduce, working professionals here in Massachusetts to opportunities in the offshore wind industry so that they can understand how their expertise, say in finance or insurance or law, could potentially be applied and transferred over to the offshore wind industry. Our second round of grants we released last year in 2020 around the summer. And this round of grants actually had 3 different sort of priority focus areas that we developed through learnings from our first round of grants, through conversations, ongoing conversations with industry, to really understand what some of those sort of more specific needs beyond just sort of essential health and safety training would be in terms of getting our workforce to become a world-class supporter for the offshore wind industry. And so these grants, the priority focus areas for these grants included partnerships. We were really looking to support partnerships between industry and local training providers to make sure that, training programs that we're setting up here in Massachusetts are really catering to the needs that the industry has, and that we're setting them up such that the, people who go through those training programs have an advantage in terms of getting hired into this industry. So 2 of our programs specifically addressed this type of a partnership, 2 of the grants that we funded. One was a partnership between the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers here in Massachusetts, partnering up with a big cable provider in the offshore wind industry to do some really specific electrician technical training program, cable training program with the training provider, and between IBEW and JDR. And then the other was a partnership between one of the big turbine manufacturers, Siemens Gamesa Renewable Energy, and a local Massachusetts startup called Vinci VR to do some really interesting and innovative virtual reality trainings specifically for offshore wind here in Massachusetts. The second priority focus area of our work was really around the expanding and sort of building on some of the initial investments that we made in 2019, and potentially also developing new programs in areas where we identified really specific additional needs. You'll see that 3 of our initial grantees actually received follow-on grants to sort of continue to build out and expand some of the programs that they had been working on through their first grant. And then UMass Lowell actually identified a very specific sort of gap that we still had here in Massachusetts. We'd set up, some of these technical training programs at the community college level. We had this graduate level certificate program at UMass Amherst. There's some engineering programs focusing specifically on offshore wind, mostly at the graduate level at Tufts. And UMass Lowell came in and said, we really are interested in identifying 4-year degree curriculum options and sort of trying to fill that 4-year degree gap that we were seeing here in Massachusetts. So that was one of those sort of new programs that was meant to fill a gap that had sort of emerged after our first round of grants. And then our last sort of priority focus area for our second solicitation was really around this idea of pathway development and expanding access to opportunity and access to offshore wind jobs. We received 2 really excellent, interesting proposals from the commercial fishing community to help. Essentially, we've got, in our commercial fishing industry, a wealth of experience and knowledge in, the maritime profession and vessel operations. But there are certain barriers that have existed for commercial fishermen to be able to take advantage of jobs in the offshore wind industry. And so 2 of the projects that we awarded in 2020 were really looking to reduce some of those barriers and help commercial fishermen identify and take advantage of offshore wind job opportunities. But we had also had a focus in that solicitation where we had been looking to expand sort of the element of diversity, equity, and inclusion in offshore wind workforce through project proposals. And I think for sort of a handful of different reasons, the solicitation went out in sort of the beginning, right at the beginning of COVID. And we had, because of the way that our fiscal year works, we were sort of constrained in terms of making awards. But we were sort of hoping to see more proposals that really looked to proactively increase the diversity, equity, and inclusion in the offshore wind workforce. And we realized that I think we needed to focus on that even more specifically to really start to drill down and get projects that start building pathways into offshore wind jobs for underserved populations, communities that may be economically disadvantaged, and those who are underrepresented in the current workforce. And so that is what mostly led us, that finding is what led us to this specific solicitation, which I will now walk through in a little bit more detail. Next slide, please, Bruce. And the next one. So this current solicitation, as I said at the outset, it really, and as Bruce mentioned, it really is focusing on trying to expand access to opportunity in the offshore wind workforce, increase diversity, increase representation, make sure that we are building an inclusive workforce from the ground up for the offshore wind industry. And we have this really unique opportunity, I think, as offshore wind is a brand new industry here, to actually do that from the start and to try to be more proactive and thoughtful about how this industry develops from the start. And so earlier this year, we released a notice of intent to issue this solicitation, the goal of which was really to collect feedback from stakeholders, industry, nonprofits in the workforce development space on different elements of this, sort of what we were proposing to do in the solicitation. We wanted to get feedback on things like the process, the timing, some of the definitions that we were using in the solicitation, how we were defining priority groups and identifying specific barriers to entry. And we received really very, very helpful feedback through that notice of intent process, which was what we used we drew on that very specifically to craft the final solicitation that is online now and open now. So I'm guessing many of you on this webinar did provide comments. We really appreciate that. And we did use that to very heavily inform how we crafted this particular solicitation. Next slide, please. Great. So then the goals of this particular solicitation, as I said, are pretty focused. So we're looking to, at least in this first round of grants, really identify projects that increase the participation of what we are defining as priority groups in some of the existing programs that we've already funded through grants to date. I'll discuss the definition that we came up with for priority groups on the next slide, but in terms of our focus on existing programs, this was really intended to, as Mass DEC has made investments in offshore wind workforce development programs to date, we want to make sure that we're setting those programs up in a way that they are able to attract and recruit and retain, diverse populations and, individuals from underrepresented communities in a way that is meaningful and that they're actually doing it. So that was the intent of our focus, specifically on some of our existing programs. We want to make sure that we're setting those programs up right and doing them, putting them together in the right way from the get-go. This solicitation is also looking for proposals that look to reduce barriers to entry for individuals who may be interested in pursuing jobs in the offshore wind space. We recognize that there are barriers to entry for, the workforce writ large that are based on sort of systemic and historic racism, socioeconomic disadvantage, other sort of key barriers to entry. And so we want to make sure we understand that is a huge issue in preventing the workforce from diversifying and being more inclusive. And so proposals that seek to actively, reduce some of those barriers are definitely of interest as part of the solicitation and one of the goals. And then finally, we're really interested in proposals that are looking to expand and broaden exposure or career guidance and counseling for students or job seekers relating to offshore wind, so that they can start to understand both what offshore wind jobs exist, what it means to work in offshore wind, why it's an exciting career opportunity, and how they might be able to enter and progress through this industry. Next slide, please. Great. So this, I'll just spend a minute on this. This is taken directly from the solicitation itself. This is our definition of priority groups. So those that we are for whom we are looking to increase participation in the offshore wind workforce through projects under the solicitation. And we received a great deal of feedback through the notice of intent process on sort of how we were defining priority groups. We've sort of built out, expanded, made more specific some of the elements here in this definition. And our goal was to be very inclusive and really focused on individuals who have been underrepresented in the workforce to date, communities and populations who are underserved or economically disadvantaged, and those who face, really significant or sort of outsized barriers to participation. Next slide. And then this here is our list of sort of potential barriers. And this is not meant to be exhaustive, but this list has been crafted based on a whole host of sort of conversations with stakeholders, with industry, with workforce development experts, to start to understand, what the potential barriers to entry may look like for individuals who might want to participate in offshore wind, but, may have trouble or challenges doing so. And so this list is sort of meant to call out and specifically list some of those key barriers, understanding that there may be others, but these are the ones that we really understand have and will continue likely to individuals who will continue to face these. So we want to figure out ways that we can tackle some of these specifically. Next slide. Great. Okay, so then the scope of the projects that we're looking for in the solicitation, again, you can find a lot more information about this specifically in the solicitation itself. But we're looking for proposals that identify and define the priority group or groups that they plan to be engaging and working with. Where applicable, we want proposals to clearly articulate and quantify any barriers to entry that they're looking to address. We definitely want proposals to describe the very specific proposed strategies, approaches, actions that they are planning to design to eliminate barriers, support priority groups, or build pathways into and through the offshore wind industry. And then finally, this is really important. We want proposals that are, setting clear and specific goals for what they consider success, and then establishing metrics and tracking those metrics over time to monitor and quantify the success of their projects. Because something that's really important for us is to understand, A, if a project is being successful, we want to make sure that we can clearly demonstrate that. And B, if for some reason, a project is not, the metrics from a project are not demonstrating success, we want to be able to understand why and figure out how we can tweak or improve upon processes and projects in the future to make sure that we are really meaningfully targeting and succeeding at getting more underrepresented groups and priority populations into the offshore wind workforce. Next slide. So this talks a little bit about applicant eligibility for this particular solicitation. You'll note that applicants, so basically the way that Mass DEC has structured the solicitation is we ask that there is a lead applicant on all proposals, and that will be the applicant that submits the proposal. That will be the applicant that ultimately ends up working directly with Mass DEC if awarded. We do very much encourage partnerships between the lead applicant and co-applicants, that we see proposals being very strong where those partnerships are meaningful and robust. So definitely encourage partnering if you are planning to submit an application and interested in doing so. But the lead applicant, we require that the lead applicant be a community-based nonprofit organization located in Massachusetts. They can be a government entity, an accredited Massachusetts vocational school, an accredited Massachusetts higher educational institution offering 2 or 4-year degree programs, a local labor union, or we also are allowing a private workforce training provider or other private company doing business in Massachusetts to be a lead applicant, provided that they partner with one of the 5 groups listed above. So we just want to make sure that we're establishing partnerships between private companies and the people on the ground who are actually working in communities, supporting workforce development very directly moving forward. And the one other thing I would quickly note is that co-applicants can be from outside of the Commonwealth, but we do require that the lead applicant be an entity within the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. Next slide. So the budget for the solicitation, Mass DEC has allocated a total of up to $600,000 for this particular solicitation. We've set a maximum award amount, and again, this was based on feedback from the notice of intent of $250,000 per award. I would note that in the solicitation, it does say that we are we will accept highly competitive proposals in excess of that cap of 250,000, but they need to clearly illustrate and justify sort of why they feel they need the funding in excess of that cap. We are not requiring in-kind or financial cost share on this particular solicitation, recognizing that that in and of itself can be a barrier. But we do want to note, given that Mass DEC has limited resources and we're trying to sort of make those resources go as far as possible, any sort of cost share, be it either in-kind or financial, will be considered favorably during the evaluation process. Next slide, please. So how to apply? This is pretty straightforward. We've put together an application form, which can be found as attachment C on the web page for the solicitation. We've also attached it as a separate Word document, so you can very easily, on that same page, so you can very easily click that, open it as a Word document and fill it out. And so we're asking that all applicants fill out this full, all of the fields of this application form, and then attach the additional attachments that we are required for review. These include things like an authorized signature and acceptance form that needs to be signed and submitted with all applications. There's a table where we ask you to specifically delineate project tasks, deliverables and milestones, and sort of a schedule for potential payments if you are awarded. And then provide any comments on a sample agreement that we have attached as well. You may also attach additional documents and sort of things like resumes for project team members and things like that if you feel they're helpful and relevant, but they're not necessary. All of the application materials, including the application form and all attachments, should be sent via email to me at offshorewind@massdec.com. The deadline to submit proposals is May 7th, which I'll get to on the next slide. And in the subject line, you need to make sure that you include the words 2021 solicitation offshore wind workforce for me to be able to file it as one of the proposals for this solicitation. And in terms of some just quickly tips for success, for a successful application, I want to draw your attention to the selection criteria, which is in section 10 of the solicitation, and encourage you to really read that selection criteria very carefully and consider these criteria when you are crafting your responses to the solicitation. This is what we use to evaluate proposals. And so keeping those criteria in mind as you're putting together responses is really, really important. Make sure that you fill out and include and attach all necessary attachments. We definitely ask you to keep responses concise, but obviously informative. We want them to be, thoughtful and, telling us what you plan to do in very specific terms, but we do ask for it to remain concise and sort of maintain brevity where possible. And then please use 11-point font or larger in all materials submitted. Next slide. Great. And so this is the estimated timeline for the solicitation. We released it back in early March. Obviously, we're hosting this webinar today. It's the 25th. We will be taking written questions, as I mentioned at the outset of this webinar, to offshorewind@massdec.com, and those are due by end of day on April 7th. So all questions must be submitted in writing in order for them to receive a formal response from Mass DEC. And Mass DEC will be posting all of the questions that we receive with the answers by April 16th. And then proposals are due via email for the solicitation by May 7th, again to offshorewind@massdec.com. And we are anticipating a notification of award sometime in July of this year. So that's our goal for the solicitation timeline. Next slide, please. So that is some more information about sort of the solicitation and the details that fall in it. Like I said, all of this information can be found in the solicitation itself online. At this point, we're now going to take some questions. I think I've been seeing some questions come into the chat. So thank you so much for submitting those. And you can also, just a reminder, you can raise your hand. You can click the little raise hand function if you'd prefer to ask a question verbally, and we will give you the opportunity to unmute yourself and ask your question if you choose to do, if you'd prefer to raise your hand and do it that way. And just a reminder that we will have a conversation here. We will try our best to sort of provide some insights on the questions that you raise. But really, if all questions should be submitted to Mass CEC in writing by April 7th for us to then provide formal written responses and offer official guidance through those responses. So with that, thank you. We'll now open it up for questions. And I think Bruce and Julie will be helping me out with that.
I will. So you obviously have been focused on providing the updates, and Julie and I have started to look at the chat. I do want to thank everybody. You've already provided us with a fair number, so please be patient as we try to get through all of these. First thing I'd like to do is I'm just going to stop sharing this and give us a little bit bigger view, at least here on this side, into the chat. And then I'm going to take care of a couple of these that I've seen come in. So I know Susanna had to leave, but she asked about sharing a link, and I think this came up elsewhere of this webinar recording. We will do that. It will be on the same page as the solicitation, and we can provide a link in the chat here, and certainly get that back out. So yes, the webinar will be available, and you should be able to click through. We in the solicitation, and I believe even on the, and Kirsten, help me out here, on the solicitation page, we are linking to some of these other resources that Kirsten mentioned. So for example, there was a question about the 2018 workforce assessment. There's a link to that. There's a link to a summary of the programs that we have supported with grants in 2019 and 2020. And then importantly, and this gets to, I think, a question, it looks like from Edward about, and I think someone else about essentially apprenticing, is the career pathways. So cleanenergyeducation.org, lots of information about job opportunities and the pathways in a number of different areas, but there's a whole section focused on offshore wind. And yes, and apprenticeship, as with many other trades, entry level after some trainings, some classroom and field, folks are able to onboard into sort of apprentice level jobs. Now, there's another question here about certifications at the Test Blade Center. Those certifications are specific to certifying the blades themselves. So we aren't providing any type of occupational certifications there. So I think there's a couple. Kirsten, I'll pause and see if you want to take up some others now that you've had a chance to review.
Sure. I'm seeing one here asking a question about the timeline. So I had put the timeline up for the solicitation itself, and I think maybe there's understandably some confusion around. Bruce was talking earlier about the Massachusetts offshore wind procurement timeline, which the Department of Energy Resources, in partnership with the utilities here in Massachusetts, are putting out. They're in the process right now. They've released a draft of what's also called a solicitation or a procurement for an additional 1,600 megawatts of offshore wind. So that was the timeline that Bruce was discussing earlier. And the timeline for this particular solicitation, which is a Mass CEC initiative, sort of separate from that state level procurement, is the one that I had up on the screen with proposals due May 7th. So those are proposals due specifically to Mass CEC.
Yeah, and I do want to remind everybody, we sort of provided this webinar today as sort of an informational forum, but you should really, if you have any doubt about a question, just please send it to us in written format to the offshore wind at Mass CEC, because in order for our lawyers to be happy for the solicitation, we want to be able to provide that in writing. So this is sort of an additional forum. Mostly, I think, to give people additional background on offshore wind, but also trying to walk you through the solicitation. in terms of timelines and the selection criteria and all that other stuff, you really need to go to the solicitation itself. That really is the official forum for the proposals that we are seeking. Quickly, I got one other question here about partnerships, including offshore wind developers and supply chain providers. It's an excellent question. We do want partners to be connecting up where possible with, we'll just call it industry, right? But we really want, instead of providing Mass CEC grant funds to a developer or a manufacturer, they've got some resources of their own. We want to provide our resources to partners, community-based, academic-based, others, government, that are going to be able to work with industry, but really have a better insight into the needs on the ground here in the Commonwealth. So that's why we're encouraging those partnerships. And Kirsten, I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
Yeah, no, I think that covers it for partnerships. I'm seeing a question here about I think it's about the eligibility of tribal governments to apply, and that would fall under our eligibility criteria for public government entities. So yes, a tribal government we would consider eligible under this solicitation. I am also seeing a question about a cap on sort of student and trainee stipends relating to proposals here. This is something that we, in the solicitation itself, I don't believe we included a specific cap. We ask that in the application form, all applicants provide a really clear sort of breakdown and a justification for why, if they're asking for funding for certain elements, which potentially a stipend or scholarship funding would fall under that, sort of why they feel that's necessary and justifying sort of the amount that they are proposing per student. So again, I would recommend please submit questions like that in writing, because we will be able to provide a more sort of definitive written response. But I did want to just sort of address that here as well. But definitely submit that as a written question to offshorewind@masscec.com, and we can include that in our written responses on when we submit those on April 16th.
Kirsten, we had a raised hand, so we have a verbal question from Mary Vogel. So Julie or someone, could you unmute Mary and she can ask it to us verbally. Great, Mary, you should be able to unmute. Excellent.
Yeah, I have actually a two-part question. I had a pre-apprenticeship training program for people wanting to get into the union building trades. We're based in Boston, but we're part of a consortium of pre-apprenticeship programs across the state. The solicitation refers to communities outside of southeastern Mass, so across the state that in terms of the populations that would be served, so environmental justice communities and gateway cities. But these jobs are really going to be located in the southeastern part of the state in the Cape, correct?
I don't think that's necessarily true. I think obviously there's going to be some of the activity focused down in those regions with the port locations and certainly some of the established institutions, you saw from the other examples. But we're here to support workforce development broadly in the Commonwealth. And we're not going to be placing any geographic bias on the selection. We're going to be looking for the proposals that have identified barriers, ways to be inclusive and address the barrier for priority groups, and those which are going to provide the biggest value proposition for the Commonwealth and for the industry.
Yeah, I'd maybe just add to that really quickly that, we see opportunities there will be certain jobs that, as Bruce said, will sort of focus in southeastern Massachusetts, things like that require being on site at a port, for instance, like that will likely sort of congregate in the southeastern region of Massachusetts. But there are certainly elements like manufacturing, for instance, that could take place throughout the state. There are, different sort of logistics, management, things like that can take place elsewhere as well. So there are some occupations that we see as sort of geographically specified, and others that I think, we've identified over 150 unique occupations. And again, I would point you to the cleanenergyeducation.org career pathway maps, So there, we do see a lot of opportunity, not only in Southeastern Mass, but throughout the Commonwealth for, workforce training relating to offshore wind.
Well, I was specifically addressing construction occupations, so, building trades workers. So I suspect that most of those jobs will be related to actually constructing the wind turbines and,
Right.
okay.
Mary, if I could just quickly, I know you had a two-part, but let me just sort of respond to that because I think it's important for, again, context. Vineyard Wind and Mayflower Wind are the ones who are essentially constructing and installing their, wind projects. They will be, and Vineyard Wind is now actively negotiating a project labor agreement and working through the Building Trades Council. And that, I think, in turn will sort of specify the different trades and the different scopes. And then the trades, as you know, will work with their locals and then outside their locals to ensure that they're going to be able to provide enough of the, skilled workers for the scopes that were negotiated in the PLA. Is that helpful?
That is helpful, and we're a union program, so I am familiar with that. So the other part of the question is, as you probably know, as a pre-apprenticeship program, we're placing people into union apprenticeships. Those apprentices, and when they become journey workers, may work on a variety of projects. So that although they may ultimately end up on the offshore wind projects, that may not be the case, depending upon where their career leads them. So in terms of if you're a pre-apprenticeship program and you want to show outcomes, would we have to show that they're actually going to be employed on these projects?
That's a really excellent question. I don't think there's any way that an awardee could necessarily guarantee that anybody ends up, fully employed and with a successful career. So, I think what we're trying to do is maybe take it down a couple levels. So, what would be the barrier or the difficulty in bringing that group or individual into and then maybe setting up a metric which is, okay, here's the barrier, here's how we want to solve that. So I don't know, it's kind of maybe it's a bad metaphor, but you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. We want to be able to lead the horse to the water, and then we'll work on the drinking part too. And apologies if that's a bad metaphor.
No, that's helpful. Thank you.
Yeah. I'm also seeing a whole bunch of really pretty specific questions. And again, we're trying to do our best here on this webinar to have a conversation, but I am strongly advising you guys to send these to us in writing because that will be the formal response. So, not to be too much of a pointy head on that, but please do so. I think it'll make everybody happier if we're able to do that in writing. Kirsten, you want to pick up a couple? I haven't been paying attention to the chat right in the last few minutes.
Yeah, I think we've got another hand raised. Let me see. Julie, can you unmute John Buddy Andrade?
Hi, can you hear me?
We can.
Anybody?
Hi, good morning, Christian, Bruce. Hi, Buddy Andre from New Bedford. I just wanted to be clear about when we talk about the unions and pre-apprenticeship programs and all that. And we also have to take into consideration that the companies predominantly that are getting the contracts are coming from overseas. So between the overseas companies and the unions, who are international entities, meaning that if they have a need for 18 people and there's only 4 or 5 in Massachusetts, they can go to Connecticut, they can go to Rhode Island, they can go to New York and bring those people in as well. So my concern has always been how much of an impact is it going to be in Massachusetts? And to the lady from Boston, we want to spread out as far as we can to recruit and bring in as many people as possible. so that we can make sure we get enough people to participate in this project, this new industry, which is so important. And for me, it's about equal opportunity. It's about affirmative action. It's about guaranteeing that these jobs are going to go to local residents and minorities in these communities between Bedford and Boston, Springfield, and the like. However, I am concerned about, are there any legal parameters that are going to make this a guarantee, I hate to say that, that local residents, minorities in particular, are going to get this. For instance, if you're bringing on the unions, they bring everybody in from all over the place. As far as California, they can do that. What is the guarantee that guys who are not in the union, who are not in a pre-apprenticeship program, are going to have the same level of equal access or opportunity to get into a training program as well as to get a job?
Buddy, thanks. Yeah, I think you've raised really, a number of different kind of issues and questions in that. I'll start, and maybe Kirsten, and always great to have the challenging questions from Buddy, because you do such an excellent job of engaging and thoughtfully, and we do appreciate it. Yeah, I think certainly there's going to be a period where we are going to have a little bit of a hybrid, where our skilled trades, apprentices and journeymen are going to need to essentially learn directly from our European counterparts, because right now there are no wind farms offshore under construction in US where they can go and get the hands-on equipment specific training that they're going to need in order to sort of qualify to essentially build US projects. So that said, after that has happened, it is the full intent of, I know developers as well as the turbine manufacturers and the installers and the unions to start to move that model locally. So after a journeyman has gone over to Denmark, helped install a project over there, or two, come back over here, works underneath a European foreman. Now that individual is now qualified to become a foreman. And this cycle starts where we start to decrease the number of international participants in this workforce. And I think that across the board is the intent of everybody here. Now, there's going to be some specifics about, sort of how that happens. And I think a lot of the detail is going to be in the project labor agreement. And we don't have good visibility into that at this point in time. So we're going to have to wait until that's done, that's been negotiated, and, look to that to be able to both try to incentivize and where we can try to require, and I know there will be other sort of policy measures in place, equal opportunities in those onboarding. Kirsten, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, the only other thing that I would say is one of the other reasons that we're sort of focusing in on some of our existing training and educational programs that we've sort of set up through Mass DEC to date is because as we've made those grants, we've done that in really close coordination with our industry partners. And so they have essentially been working closely with us to say that, like, yes, this, for instance, electrician training program with IBEW is really important and something that, like, we see as critical for Massachusetts workers to get this particular training in order to get jobs in this industry. So that partnership in setting up some of those sort of grant programs that we've set up to date has been really with the focus of making sure that we're doing it in a way that industry has a degree of buy-in and is essentially saying, like, these are important programs and we want to see them in order for us to be able to employ Massachusetts workers.
Can I leave with this? After all that, how are we going to evaluate this? Everybody's going to have a lot of good intentions. Everybody's going to say we're going to do all we can, all the good verbiage, which is important to hear. We are proud that we were able to get at least 2 individuals in the Power Drivers Union 2 years ago I believe one gentleman is still involved. And so that's one out of so many. But what is going to be the evaluation? What is going to be how we measure? Did we do a good job here? Because Bruce, as you know, as I've spoken in the past, that there's always been a concern with us with the PLAs. There's always been a concern with us with the process that the unions have. And I'm trying not to get into all the isms, but that is a concern, and you brought it up earlier as a concern. And we want to make sure that we're able to have a transparency and accountability, and we can see how the process is working, and to make sure that it is working. What is the evaluation? How do we make sure that the companies from England have a minority kid from the south end of New Bedford in England working on a project? How do we guarantee that the unions are going to do that same kind of stuff that we're asking? So there has to be some sort of checks and balances, and I'm just trying to figure out what you guys may have in place.
Right, buddy. Again, another excellent and difficult question.
Sorry.
So, and I think I have to answer this in sort of two ways. One is, some of this is just out of Mass CEC's control and domain. So we aren't negotiating the PLA. We aren't hiring anybody. We are trying to, through all of our tools available, whether that's financial resources and technical support and our facilitation and coordination and all the tools available, trying to address this issue of, as we build this workforce from the ground up, being inclusive and diverse and equal from the start. So, we're trying, and I guess so there's a couple parts to this. I know that both developers in their bids into the Commonwealth have committed to tracking jobs. And I think in those commitments, they have specified that they will not just track the number of, job years or whatever, but they will provide some demographics and other sort of characterization of those jobs. And again, while we're not involved in the PLA negotiation, I'm pretty confident that there will be some inclusion of what you're getting at in that agreement. Now, I can't influence that, but I do know, at least I don't want to speak on behalf of Vineyard Wind, and I don't want to speak on behalf of the trade councils or the unions, but I think there is certainly a growing awareness and a growing desire to, as we build this, as I did before, make it equal opportunity. Kirsten, do you want to add anything?
I think you covered that.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, buddy. Take
Thanks,
care. It was another hand.
Yeah, so just before that, I'm just seeing a couple questions in the chat. We'll get to the hands in just a second. So I did want to address two questions that we have in the chat. The first was around minority disadvantaged women-owned business enterprises and sort of the role of those types of businesses within the offshore wind industry. So Mass CEC certainly sees that as, the involvement of diverse suppliers is really important also to building up this industry. The question was sort of, will a proposal be entertained under this solicitation relating to those businesses? I would say this solicitation is very focused on workforce training and development, just because that has been the focus of our grants to date in this space. But that's to say, Mass CEC also has a significant focus on supply chain development. We have a supply chain directory where we send companies who are interested in participating both in Massachusetts and outside of Massachusetts, who are interested in participating in the Massachusetts offshore wind supply chain and market. We do have and are actually in the process of adding the designations in accordance with the Supplier Diversity Office for diverse businesses to identify in that directory. And we are in the process right now. It's just maybe a little bit, we're a little bit maybe further behind our workforce development efforts in this space, just by nature of the fact of the timing of projects, looking to identify ways that we can do a better job of supporting women, minority, veteran-owned businesses, all of those sort of diverse businesses listed by the Supplier Diversity Office through our workforce development work. So this particular solicitation is very focused on workforce and workforce training and workforce education, and sort of the career development opportunities within offshore wind. But supplier diversity is a huge focus of Mass DEC's offshore wind team as well. And I encourage you to reach out and have a conversation with us if you're interested in learning more about that.
Yeah, just a few other points on that issue, not on the workforce, but on the sort of business supply chain. We have and will continue to run what we call supply chain forums, which are opportunities for local suppliers and service providers to better understand what the opportunities are, where they may be, and how they can better compete for those opportunities. And we will continue to do that. The other thing I will say is that we have supported Vineyard Wind and will and anticipate to do so as we head into the summer and fall, these Meet the Buyer events, where their tier ones in turn look for tier twos and tier threes, and they in turn look for other opportunities. And again, the focus here, and it is a commitment on the part of Vineyard Wind, is to look local first. So it doesn't mean that they necessarily are obligated, but they are doing everything in their power to see if there's a qualified and competitive local supplier or service provider to bring on board in their enterprise.
Thanks, Bruce. And then there's one more here from the chat before we go over to the raised hand. There's a question that I think I had missed previously about opportunities to partner with either developers or others in the offshore wind industry on proposals coming in under the solicitation. Like I said, we absolutely encourage partnerships. Partnerships with industry are certainly, we want to make sure, like I've said, we're setting up programs so that the industry who will be hiring people into jobs in offshore wind is, aligned and supportive of the programs and projects that we're supporting. So we definitely encourage partnerships. I don't know, the only thing I would say is in the past, some of our developer partners have been involved in sort of the review process and helping us sort of understand that, from the context of the industry, the ecosystem of and supporting the ecosystem of grants that we've been providing. And so I would just that's still maybe a little bit TBD. I'd certainly encourage conversations with them, but certainly encourage partnerships with industry.
Yeah, just to put it simply, if the lead entity is one of the 5 that are contained in the solicitation, they can partner with any other partners, provided that that's the lead entity. And again, we're getting into, I think, sort of formal responses. So my general counsel would be happy by saying, please put it in writing. Be glad to respond also in writing. So thank you for that. We want to go to the hand raised.
Yes, please. Julie, could you unmute Catherine Manning?
Hi. Hi there. I was wondering how much you would support actual research into this area versus specific program development, and if you would support, I'm with a university, if you would support education programs like the undergraduate degrees, graduate degrees in terms of scholarships.
I'll take a first response, and that's I think right now, Catherine, our focus is more on sort of actions and tactics rather than information building. That said, a proposal that identified a certain need and wanted to sort of wrap that into the proposal, certainly not discouraged. But we've done a fair amount of work on assessments and information gathering, and we may need more, but we're trying to really sort of focus this in on being very sort of action oriented to identifying those barriers and creating specific outcomes to address those. Kirsten?
Yeah, I think that's right.
Thank you.
I also want to remind everybody that we're at 10:47. I think I know I do. I have a hard stop at 11. So we will try to get through all we can in the next 15 minutes or so or less. And then we would, again, encourage people to follow up in writing with additional questions. What else are you seeing there, Kirsten?
I'm seeing a question about sort of candidates, who may go through training having potentially a direct handoff into industry. I would again sort of indicate that the existing programs that we've provided grants to date have been set up in such a way that the industry has been very involved in their setup. There's no sort of guarantee that somebody who goes through those programs will get a job in offshore wind. Sort of like Bruce was saying earlier, that's very difficult for a whole variety of factors to guarantee, but we have received sort of affirmation that the programs that we've set up to date and are sort of continuing to set up are valuable to the industry, sees them as valuable credentialing opportunities for individuals to get hired into the offshore wind space. The other thing that I would just say is, we look for in proposals, some of those conversations, like we would turn this back and say that, we hope that proposals would demonstrate, conversations with potential hiring entities or training providers. We would look for you to sort of define that in the proposals you are submitting specifically. Are you seeing any other questions in the chat, Bruce?
Yes, I'm just looking here, Kirsten. Obviously doing the best we can, and keeping an eye. Julie's been an eagle eye too. Just I don't think, and certainly people can raise their hand if you feel like we may not have covered something, but I think we've covered most of these.
Seeing one more raised hand, Bruce.
Great, Mary. Is that Mary again?
Yep.
Sorry, I did put a question in the Q&A about, is there actual state funding to do the construction of these projects?
No, this is
It's all private.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Yes.
So with that, I'd encourage you, I'm not seeing additional questions right now. So if you have any final questions, please raise your hand or type them into the chat. As we've said, this has been a great conversation. Please submit any questions you asked today, as well as any others you may have in writing to us, offshorewind@massdec.com. The deadline to do that is April 7th. So please send those questions to us. We will provide formal written answers, and those formal written responses should be the ones that are considered, sort of official solicitation guidance. This has been sort of more for information sharing and sort of just having a conversation right now, but definitely submit those questions in writing. And I'm seeing, sorry.
Go ahead.
I'm just seeing one more question, but
okay.
If you.
Yeah, we'll take one last question, and then we do want to thank everybody.
Yes. So Julie, you want to go ahead and provide Edward the opportunity to unmute? Edward, you should be unmuted.
Hi, Kirsten and Bruce. This is Edward from AACA. We're like Mary, we're in Boston, and we train underemployed immigrants and low-income individuals. And right now we're doing diesel tech training with Massasoit Community College, which my understanding is very transferable to wind turbine maintenance. It's sort of a two-part question. The first is, do you have any insight, sort of like what you're talking about with the construction end of it? Will Vineyard Winds and Mayflower be dealing with the maintenance once those are up, or would they be outsourcing that to another company? And then sort of the follow-up question to that is it's more of a philosophical question here. So most of the people we train, are near homeless. So if they have to wait 2 or 3 years before they can actually get placement, it's not the most ideal sort of pathway to get there. And so in terms of looking at, for example, the ACMV program, it's a 2-year program. And, our individuals would really suffer having to wait 2 years before finishing their certification and then getting a job. So that's sort of a concern I'm voicing.
Okay, so on the first, and this is again, I think our career pathways will be helpful. So there's the construction and installation phase, and then and that's multifaceted. It includes installing the foundations and the transition pieces and the towers and all the work that goes on the land side, and then all the vessel work to make all of that happen. Then the commissioning of the turbines, and then Edward, they go into this, what you call, after they've been commissioned and they're sort of officially generating power and providing it onto the grid, they essentially are in what they call an operation and maintenance phase. The framework for that is typically, and this is sort of the industry sort of general pathway, it's not the only pathway, but typically the turbine supplier to the developer, and in this case for Vineyard Wind, the preferred turbine supplier is GE. If that holds, GE would for the first 5 years essentially provide that O&M function as part of essentially their sort of guarantee for their turbine equipment. At that point in time, Vineyard decides whether they're going to keep on the GE techs for the duration, or whether they're going to onboard or provide their own technicians and go a different direction. So that's how that happens. The question you have is a really good one, and it's really the philosophical one about this sort of. There's a couple different sort of time considerations. One is, the lag. Obviously, we don't have a mature workforce as we speak today, and it will take people trainings and learnings and hands-on work to become qualified, and that obviously takes some time. I think we're in Massachusetts. We're in a really pretty good place considering our other sort of states and looking across the landscape. That's not to say that we don't have lots of work to do here. But if everything holds and they're going to, get their final permits, do their financial close, they're going to begin sort of some of the offshore cable work and some of the onshore construction, certainly in 22, maybe even possibly late this year. Their predominant of their offshore work beginning in 2023. So one thing we struggle with is, when do we start? Because we're very aware of this lag, and certainly we don't want to be credentialing people and then they have to wait for years, months, or even years for opportunities. I think we're trying to do the best we can with the sort of the visibility we have in this industry. We're at this really, really extremely difficult point because we're, the tip of the spear right here. So I think we're trying to navigate this the best we can. We're always open to constructive criticism and recommendations. Yeah, so hopefully that tried to answer your question. Kirsten, maybe you want to add something.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. The only thing I would say is the ability to leverage sort of adjacent or similar skill sets, like you had mentioned, I think diesel technicians and, the opportunities for basically, if we can train people up for opportunities, not only in offshore wind, but in other sectors as well, we see that as really valuable because, offshore wind will employ a lot of people, but it won't employ everybody. And so looking for those areas where we can leverage similar skill sets, I think that would be of particular interest as well.
Great, thanks.
Thank you.
Okay, I think Kirsten, I think we're probably going to have to start to close this. I do want to thank each and every one of you who did call in. We are very hopeful that we're going to receive some very competitive, some very thoughtful, some very important proposals. The only other thing I would say is that, I hope we can fund them all. We'll have to sort of wait and see. And we're going to have probably some very hard decisions in front of us. But we appreciate all the support and guidance many of you have provided through the notice of intent process. And we really need to build this with you. We can't build this alone. So again, a huge thanks on the part of Mass CEC to all of you.
Yeah, thank you all. I just want to emphasize that this is also probably sort of a first step in this space. You know, this is a huge priority for Mass CEC, for our offshore wind team, but for our organization as a whole. And so, yeah, thank you so much for the feedback that you've provided to date. We're really excited about, you know, reviewing proposals that we get in. We look forward to your questions submitted again by April 7th. To offshorewind@massdec.com, and yeah, looking forward to sort of seeing how this can continue to progress and grow. Great. So with that, I think thanks again. Enjoy the rest of your day, and we will follow up with the link to the recording, the slides, and all of the solicitation information to all of those who were able to join us on the webinar today.
Thank you. Take care. Bye-bye.